I would like to go over the assignment. I will also explain the basic concepts and how to approach this. As you can see, we have a form here. If I were to click the send button with nothing filled in, I will get some error messages telling the user that they need to fill in the missing information. If I fill in the first name and last name and then click the button, notice that the error messages for those two text boxes disappear. However, the other error messages stay there. In the event that the user were to decide to clear out the form, not only would it make sense to clear out the form values, but we would also want to get rid of those error messages also. So the point is that when you're developing a computer application, you just can't test it when the user does everything correctly. You need to test it every which way so that you know your program will work under all conditions. So we want to make sure that everything is filled in before we can send the information. We have 3 text boxes. They all need to have values. The email address has to be in a correct format. The drop-down list or select element needs to have a selection other than the original please choose one default selection, and the user has to check the checkbox. When they click the send information button, they will be taken to a thank you page. You always need to understand the HTML code before you can start working with JavaScript. Here we have our opening and closing form tags. Here our form has an action. It is a static HTML page, thankyou.html. I put that in there so that you will know when the action is called. We have method equals post, we have a name and an ID. We have a text box for the first name with an ID, text box for the last name with an ID, text box for the email with an ID. We have a select element which is the drop-down list with an ID. We have a checkbox with an ID. So retrieving the values should not be difficult because typically you work with the IDs in form elements because they are all typically unique. When the user clicks the button, type equals submit, the action of the form is called, and the data is sent to the action. In the real world, the action would probably be a PHP file. However, we are substituting an HTML file so you can learn how to validate this form. Notice in my text boxes, I have a placeholder attribute which indicates to the user what you would like them to type in addition to the label. We also have a max length attribute. You always want to set a max length for a text box so the user is prohibited from entering a lot of information as they could try to enter malicious data. Here I have the same form. There is no JavaScript on this page. And what I want to do is I want to demonstrate the action being called. Notice nothing is filled in. The minute I click the button, the action is called. Your job is to keep this form on the page until everything is correctly filled in, and at that point you can tell the browser to submit the form, the action will be called, and the data will be sent to the action. So how do we approach this? We have a button, input type equals submit. The user is going to click that and they're going to call a function. We always call a function when we click something on the page. So the first thing you want to do, you want to set up the event handler and you want to test that that function is indeed called. Do not start writing code until you know that you can click on the button and call a function. Because we are working with type equals submit, we will be using the submit event. The submit method is a method of the form itself, so we will be using the ID of the form. So here we have document.getElementById, FRM. We're going to store it in a variable, the form. That way we can reference the form. Now we have our add event listener method. Okay, we're working with the submit event, and the name of my function is check form. Here is my function. I am passing the E to the check form function. The E stands for the event object. Now I am going to code in e.preventDefault. That prevents the default action of the form. What is the default action of the form? It submits the data to the action, to the server. Okay, this is how you keep the form on the page until everything is filled in. And you test that you can call that function. I am using an alert. You can also use the console. Do not assume anything. Test it. If you cannot call this function, there's no sense in writing any code because it won't be executed. When I click the button, there is my alert. The function is called. I click OK. The form stays on the page. That was a very important step in starting out this application. Now let's code in the check for the first text box. Let's look at the HTML one more time. For every form element, I have a span element next to the label. That is empty. That is for the error message. Notice there is no ID. That's because you don't need to put an ID everywhere. We can access that by using the previous sibling property. So back to our function, the first thing you want to do is to declare a variable to hold the reference to that form element. So here I have document.getElementById, fname. That is the ID value. I'm storing it in a variable called fname. Now we have an if to determine whether or not the text box is empty. So the value property will retrieve the value of the text box. GetElementById just references that object. So here we have fname.value in parentheses .trim because we want to trim any excess spaces from the front or the end of that string. We compare it to an empty string. So if this condition is true, the code inside the curly braces will execute. And what I am doing is I am setting an error message here. Using the previous element sibling property, I'm setting the inner HTML to the value of required. So let's test our form. There is nothing in the first name box. I click the button. There's my error message. Very good. All right, let me put my name in here. Now, when the user does fill this out correctly, and now they click the button again, well, there's a name there, there's a value, but we still see the error message. We need to get rid of that error message. There's several ways to do that. You can do that in the else of the if, or you can clear out all the error messages every time you use the function. I'll try to show you both ways. So now I have added my else. So in the event that the if condition is false, meaning there is something in there, we will clear out the error message if it exists. It might not exist, but we're going to clear it out anyway. Now let's do the last name. And I would like to point out that I am doing one thing at a time and testing along the way. Do not sit down, type code for half an hour, and wonder why nothing works. This is how you find your errors. we're going to set up a variable to hold an object reference to the last name. The coding for the last name is identical to the coding for the first name, except that we're using a different variable name. So here, if lname.value.trim is equal to an empty string, we give them the error message. If not, we remove the error message. Now let's test our code. I click the button. I see 2 error messages. When the user types in a value and they click the button again, those error messages disappear. Now let's add the email. So we set the variable to hold the object reference to the email. Now let's look at the code for the email. It's a little different than the other 2 text boxes. I have a compound condition here in my if. Not only am I checking that the value is not an empty string, I am also checking that it is a correct email address format. I am doing that using a regular expression. I have sample code showing you how to do this, and I would just like to let you know that there are regular expressions available on the internet for every conceivable type of format that you can possibly need in a JavaScript form validation application. Now let's take a look at our form. I click the send button. Now I have 3 error messages. Very good. After I fill in those 3 text boxes, I click the button. The error messages disappear. Notice that I am testing and coding one thing at a time, which is the proper approach to programming. Now we will validate the dropdown. By default, the first option is selected. So we want to determine if they made a choice by determining if the first selection is still selected. So let's take a look at our HTML for our select element. Here we have an opening and closing select tag, and for each choice there is an opening and closing option element. The select tag has a name and an ID. Each option has a value. Only one can be selected. Therefore, that will be the value of this object. For text boxes, the value is what the user types. Here, the user is not typing anything. They are just clicking down the arrow. Notice that the default value equals none, N-O-N-E. That is what we will test against. First, we need to set up our variable to reference that object. I am using the variable name amount. Now, in my if condition, I have amount.value, and I'm determining if it equals none. If it equals none, we know they did not make a choice, so we give them the error message, and then we also clear out that error message in the else. So now let's test our form. I can click the button. I see error messages, and when I choose an amount and I click, the error message disappears. Finally, we want to determine if the user checked the checkbox, because that is a requirement. So let's take a look at our HTML. This is our checkbox. It has a name and an ID. In this case, the values are the same. It also has a value attribute. All the user will do is check a box, and that will return the value. We don't care about the value. We only care about whether the box is checked. So let's set up our object reference for the checkbox, and I'm using the variable age. So here we have our if condition, age.checked not equal true. We're testing to see if it is checked. If it is, it will have the checked property set to true, essentially. And if it doesn't, then the if condition is true and we execute the code and we give the error message. If it's checked, then in the else, we clear out the error message. So returning to our form, nothing is filled in. I click send. I see all of my error messages. And if I were to fill in one thing at a time, click the button. Those error messages will disappear. The form elements not filled in, the error messages will remain. Okay, so I have filled everything in and I'm clicking the button and nothing is happening. Remember, we set the default action. Now we need to determine that since everything is filled in, we will send the data to the server or to the action, which is an HTML page for our purposes. So we need a way to determine when to do that. In programming, there are usually several different ways to do the same thing. A very common approach to determining when to do something is to set what is referred to as a flag variable. So we're setting this variable is okay equals true. It's a Boolean value, no quotes involved here. What we will do is if there's a problem, we will set that variable to false. We will have one more if at the very end determining if that value is true. And if that value is true, we know that it's time to submit the form. So I have my if conditions, which are testing for an error. I place is okay equals false inside every one of these if conditions. Therefore, if we have one error, is okay is no longer true, it will be false. At the end of all my if conditions, I have my final if is okay. That essentially means it's true. You could write is okay equals true if you wanted to. If the value of the variable is still true, then we will submit the form form.submit. That is the submit method of the form object, and the action will be called. If one of those ifs turns is okay to false, this final if will not be true. The form will not be submitted until everything is filled out correctly. So here's our form again. I have some errors here. When I go back and I fix everything and I click submit, everything is technically okay. There's my action being called. We have a clear form button here. Supposing at some point the user wants to clear the whole form, and they click this. This is type equals reset. What it does, it resets the form to its initial values. Okay, when I click clear form, okay, the form was reset, however, the error messages are still there. That is not very user-friendly. Again, you need to think about what could the user possibly do to mess up your form. When you create an application and you test it in the order in which it's supposed to be run, then it works beautifully. But if you start messing things up, then you see where you need to write some more code to accommodate different user actions. And that is the key to being a good interface developer. So we need to get rid of those error messages when the user clicks the clear form button. So this is our button, input type equals reset, value equals clear form, and we can use the reset method of the form object. So I have added another event listener, listening for the reset event that's connected to the form element, and I am going to call a function called clear errors. Now I have two functions. So there are two functions that I'm working with, one for each button. At the top of the script tag is my check form function. This is actually a very long function. Notice I have commented the ending delimiter of that first function. Please do this. It makes it a lot easier to see where your functions begin and end. Now I can easily see my second function. Here's my function clear errors. Now I am going to loop through all of the span elements. They all contain the error messages. So I will set up a variable, let ERRMSG, and I will use my for loop because this is an array, it has a length, and I will loop through each span and I will set the inner HTML to an empty string. So let's take a look at our form. I'm going to click the send information button. I have all these error messages. Now if I wanted to clear the form, there you go, they're gone. Nice, clean interface. Just to let you know, and you don't have to do this, we just created a function that clears error messages. If you wanted to, you could get rid of all of these else's. So here's my function call. So I'm calling a function from within a function, which happens quite often in programming. And back to the form. I send it, and this time I uncommented that to see that file has been changed. I see my error messages and I clear them out. So this is the overall approach and process of validating a form. Obviously, if you had more form elements, you might create some functions to do some of the checking rather than repeating the same code over and over. However, that is not required as this is a beginning level class.